I'm a rarity in Unitarian Universalism. I'm a fifth-generation Unitarian. Our grandchildren are seventh generation. I mention this not for the accolades, but to give you some context to my own journey into this ministry, into this faith. When Francis and I decided that I would enter seminary at the Meadville-Lombard Theological School at that time, part of the University of Chicago, in the late 1980s. We did so with fewer reservations than perhaps we should have had, although we had plenty. And that's another story. I was to inherit a little money when I turned 30 years old. I was 29 at the time. And I knew very little about our faith, actually, even though I had grown up in a Unitarian fellowship in Croton-on-Hudson, New York. I graduated in 8th grade from Sunday school. And I had they gave me a World Religions Bible. Now, for geeky people like me, parenthetically, it's a misnomer because a Bible only refers to the scriptures of Christianity and Judaism and not to the other writings that are sacred in world religions, such as the Tao Te Ching, the Buddhist Sutras, the Quran, or the Mahabharata. Before applying to graduate school, I went to New York City to visit Don Harrington, Reverend Don Harrington, who was then senior minister of our community church of New York and an old family friend. As we sat down in his office, he began by telling me something that I did not know. He said, "Did you know that you have actually two grandfathers, great-grandfathers, who are Unitarian ministers, one by marriage and one by birth?" I said, "What? You don't know that, do you? Because I imagine that your father, who was a good friend of Don's, didn't tell you that. The Reverend Daniel Webster Morehouse. And he went to the same seminary that you're considering going to, but when he went to it in 1880s, it was still in Meadville, Pennsylvania, before it merged with the University of Chicago and Lombard College, which was a Universalist college in Lombard, Illinois. My great-grandfather was a district superintendent of Western New England, and he is buried in Springfield, Massachusetts. All of this I did not know. I wondered why my grandfather, his son Edward Morehouse, had not told me, or my father, Ward Morris, had not told me. And when I went back to talk to my dad about this, I said, "What up?" And he said, "Well, I don't really have a lot of use for ministers. They're usually a little too preoccupied with matters of the heart, and I think they need to be preoccupied with justice. And besides, I didn't want to cloud your choice." Much later, when working on my doctorate at the same graduate school, I would discover deep in the archives my great-grandfather's sermons, none of which I can read because his handwriting was so flourishy Victorian, his book plate that he stamped his books with, and some of his journals. Two of those things were gifted to me in my graduation with my doctorate in 2015. Part of the reason my forefathers did not feel it was necessary to share this ancestry, I think, is this fierce belief we have as Unitarians that we are free to decide what we believe. The freedom of religion is so important to us. Indeed, our heritage stretches back to our roots in Transylvania and also Great Britain, and then the United States. And I want to say here that it's very important to understand that Transylvanian Unitarianism is a viable and living faith. And while part of our roots as American Unitarian Universalists comes from that tradition, they stand on their own, in their own free faith. The freedom to choose how we worship is part of what makes us what is known with the dissenting church tradition, the dissenting church tradition. And we join hands there with Baptists and Congregationalists and Quakers. We were never supposed to fit into the orthodoxy, or I would say as American UUs into Christianity as it's seen today. January 13th marks the 457th anniversary of the Edict of Torda, the foundational document enacted by King John Sigismund of Transylvania and his prophet, his court preacher, Francis David. As my colleague John Gibbons wrote, many UU congregations view anything before consolidation of the Unitarians and the Universalists in 1961 as ancient history. Even our 19th century forebears are more often understood as quaint characters. Mary Louise Alcott, or Henry David Thoreau, or Ralph Waldo Emerson. And when we need the authority of these transcendent speakers in the past, we don't really understand the faith that they embraced, which is very different than ours. But what they did have, and what we still have, is this belief in the freedom to believe. The 16th century was a laboratory of religious reformation in Europe, succeeding in the establishment of the Lutheran, then the Anglican, and the Reformed variations of Christianity in so many different forms that there are hundreds and hundreds of denominations and sects today. But our Unitarian Universalist traditions find closer affinity to the radical reformers, this is what John Gibbons said, who are unsatisfied with the results and pressed for further changes in theology and practice and authority. Because to believe in anything other than the orthodoxy in the 16th century could get you killed. In Transylvania, these radical reformers found some traction. King John Sesmin took interest in further reform and supported a series of theological debates in the 1560s. Close at hand was his court physician, George Beardarta, who was also a supporter of this radical religious idea that you were free to believe whatever you want. And he was familiar with the anti-Trinitarian writings of Michael Servetus, who John Calvin burned at the stake in Geneva. And further Italian theologians earlier in that century who also thought about the freedom to believe and understand God in the way that made most sense to you. After a decade of theological debate and the influence of David and Beardarta, King Sesmin's Edict of Torda concluded his theological explorations January 13, 1568, issuing a statement of religious tolerance, which you heard just read. There is much in the Edict of Torda that points to our tradition that we continue to rely on, the grounding commitment that faith is not endowed with purpose by governments or empires, but by the sacred and the holy that rests in our own hearts. That the freedom of the pulpit to speak the truth and love as we see it, and the freedom of the pews, or in this case the chairs, to respond to that is also part of this tradition. And the stirrings of our commitment to resist authoritarianism as a religious practice, such as we are doing this very day, and such as our ministers did in Minneapolis on Wednesday, is signaled in the Edict of Torda. Indeed, the deep faith in our freedom binds us to our partner congregation in Varfava. It's a long and wonderful and warm and fruitful partnership. But freedom is only one route to our resistance towards orthodoxy and the abuse of power. And the other is tolerance and respect. I think one of the pitfalls of reliance on individual choice in matters of faith is that we sometimes ignore the needs of others, or we weaken the communal bonds of being together as a congregation. For years, when I was a younger minister, I taught the course called Building Your Own Theology. Who here has taken that? Anybody taken that course? Some of you are still out there. Building Your Own Theology. Wonderful course, fabulous course. Until I came to believe that individual faith is not what our ancestors envisioned. We're not just a bunch of individuals running around getting whatever we want from the spiritual smorgasbord, right? A little inspiration here, a Jewish Seder there, a Buddhist meditation over there. That's not what this means. We are also bound, as we are bound to our partner church, to one another. It's not my way or the highway as Unitarian Universalists. It means, this may come as a shock to you, you don't always get what you want. Which is why my doctoral thesis took the idea of building your own theology and rethought it as a new curriculum, which is entitled Creating Theology Together. The final, or the next root of our resistance is justice. Justice is very important. Reverend Ashley Haran, the vice president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, is based in Minneapolis. In fact, she lives in the same neighborhood where Nicole Good was murdered by that ICE agent on Wednesday. And she was there to protest the shooting and was pepper sprayed by the federal agents. And she told Religious News Services that she, quote, said, "My Unitarian Universalist faith is the belief that every single human life has inherent worthiness and dignity, and that we are all interdependent as human beings and neighbors. The combination of these things means there's actually not a question about showing up for something like this. The greatest form of sin, she said, is feeling like that we are separate from other people. Justice is what love looks like in action. And justice is one of the roots that feeds our faith, which is why we're showing up at protests, which is why our church is supporting the return of John Vincent, a local Cameroon man kidnapped out of his car by ICE agents while taking his daughter to school in King of Prussia. John is here on a legal visa from Cameroon and cannot return to his country for fear of his life. I want you to know that on behalf of all of you, we have made a very large donation to his legal defense. And we will continue to use whatever resources we have to fight this injustice, because it is a proud part of our heritage as a free faith and a dissenting church. John Gibbons wrote, "There was a time in the 18th and 19th centuries when Unitarians predicted the end of religion, that reason would triumph and the need for scripture would cease to be. Our Universalist forebears predicted a time when hell would cease to be the burning issue that it is today. And indeed, as science revealed more and more about our world and the universe, it was not quite what it had been. And Universalism is still a viable part of our theology. It's part of why we are Unitarian Universalists, because we believe in the prime directive that God is love, and indeed love is at the center of everything we do." The partner church movement, which links our congregation with our partner church in Varfova, are here with congregations across Romania and other parts of the world because we realize the need to connect internationally. The partner church movement, as Kathy Cordes will tell you, has its origins in the aftermath of the war where North American congregations raised funds to replace steeple bells that had been melted down for armaments. Today, more than 50,000 Unitarians live in Transylvania, and they are a double minority. Amidst the Romanian majority, they are ethnically and culture and language Hungarian, and amidst the dominant Orthodox religion, they are Unitarian. But for all those Unitarians and otherwise that thought religion would fade away, I got news, not a chance. Religion is more about giving answers to unanswerable questions. Our God is not the God that fills in the gaps. Rather, religion is about finding greater meaning in our evolving universe and our own lives, punctuated as they are by the troubles of our wounded world. It's about living a moral life, more than what you want to believe. In my mind, that means that this religion will live on. Our religion will live on in the roots that we have watered for generations. And now I'm going to invite to our pulpit the Reverend Andrew Weber to say a little bit more about this idea of a free faith.
Good morning. Eshol naput barataim varfavan. Every time I travel to Transylvania, my understanding of our religious heritage deepens. And being in that physical space, in that place where historical events happened, helps me to contextualize and to remember our heritage. But I also learn about living a relevant faith. I learn about my own religious beliefs, my own convictions. Because Unitarian Universalism shares historic roots with Transylvanian Unitarianism. But Transylvanian Unitarianism is not our ancestor. That's a dangerous place for us to fall into, to say, oh, they are our ancestors. We have gone beyond and above them. Transylvanian Unitarianism is our sibling, just as modern, just as world-saving, just as love-promoting as our faith. And I want to share an instance, an example where I deepened my faith and my historical knowledge. This is a little bit after the Edict of Torda, which we heard briefly in 1568. There was a group of Unitarian Christians who started adopting elements of Judaism. And this makes sense, actually, because as many reformers wanted to go back to the roots of Christianity, it made sense that some of them said, well, let's go to the religion that preceded Christianity. So these Unitarian Jews in Transylvania became known as the Sabbatarians. It was named after observing the Sabbath, Sabbatarian. And in a land known at that time for religious tolerance, this group of Jews formed. who had no ancestral, no blood ties to Israel, but rather ties of faith, ties of religious conviction. It was an unusual occurrence culturally, but sadly, the history of this community parallels the hate, the anti-Semitism, the persecution which Jews see all over the world. The Sabbatarians did not gain many adherents over the centuries, and by the 19th century, there was a majority in only one village, Bozod Uifalu. And at the end of the Second World, Hungarian Transylvanians, including this village of Bozod Uifalu, found themselves, as Reverend John said, double minorities inside Romania, by religion and by ethnicity. Romania at this time was under communist rule, and Nicolae Ceausescu was especially harsh to both the ethnic and the religious minorities. And right before his fall from power, he decided to eradicate Hungarian Transylvanians by destroying their villages, deporting their population. And in 1989, the river which flowed through Bozod Uifalu was dammed, the buildings flooded, and the inhabitants moved out. The Sabbatarians, Bozod Uifalu, are no more. Now, Reverend John spoke about our history from hundreds of years ago, and this story, although starting at that time, is much more recent. This happened during most of our lifetimes. The village was flooded and its inhabitants displaced less than 40 years ago. And all that was left of Bozod Uifalu were the tops of a few buildings reaching up out of this human-made lake, and some tombstones at a graveyard that was a little bit higher elevation than the village. Now, the history and my personal story here overlap at the outskirts of Bozod Uifalu, where a memorial park has very recently been erected. The memorial park has a path which mirrors the main street of the village, and it has markers at each symbolic place where there was a building, and it has photographs, memorial photographs of the time when the village was still around. In 2018, I co-led a mindfulness pilgrimage where we stopped at this memorial and took a moment to look at the photos, to walk through the symbolic representation of the town, and to contemplate religious persecution, religious tolerance, and our faith. Now, as our group shed their packs and began walking, I took on my shepherding leadership role, and I was making sure everyone was drinking water, taking a rest, keeping an eye on our backpacks, making sure everything was safe. And as such, I took note of a boy who was selling hand-woven trinkets and milling about the area. And I'm not proud of this, but this is what happened. I responded to this young person as a scared foreigner. I assumed that he was going to either rifle through our stuff or interrupt our deeply spiritual time. And so I did the classic racist, ageist thing that so many young men of color experience here. I kept an eye on him, and I kept an eye on our bags. But rather than live into my negative expectations, this boy came up to me and started chatting. He reached out over this gap that I had created, and he started chatting with me. Our conversation was very shallow at the beginning, but it grew deeper. First, he wanted to know, was that member of our group Jean-Claude Van Damme? This was not the case, I assured him. It was not. But there we opened up more, and he told me about his grandmother who had lived in Bozod Uifalu. He told me that if we looked at one of the memorial plaques, you could actually see her stern face looking out of her house. And there I was, living into my racism, ageism, cultural privilege, being shown how to live my faith, being shown to recognize what I had missed, namely this boy's humanity. Martin Buber, a Jewish theologian, has said, when two people relate to each other authentically and humanely, God is the electricity that surges between them. How humbled and honored I have been to have that authenticity, that humanity offered to me. Right? This is where the history starts coming into the theology. the history of Unitarian Universalism, the history of Transylvanian Unitarianism, the history of Sabbatarianism. They're all tales showing us the reality of intolerance and the power of reaching beyond differences. My personal story is one showing the stark reality of intolerance and the power of reaching across those differences. Now, I want to bring it a little bit closer to home, and closer not just to home, like geographically closer, but also to Main Line Unitarian Church. 2 years ago, members of this congregation went on a pilgrimage to Warsaw, where we met many of these wonderful people in person. We visited our partner church, and the trip taught us about these overlapping histories of Unitarian Universalism and Transylvanian Unitarianism. And it also helped us nourish and deepen the personal connections we have with the people living there. My family first visited Warsaw in the 1990s, and over the years we've become very, very close friends with the family there, the Vajas family. And as with all relationships, it took time, it took work. We began our journey sleeping in their house, being guests, spending hours, literally hours, talking about the price of tomatoes in the market. And it's hours because Google Chat did not exist, Translate did not exist. We had a phrase book, and we were translating between tomato and paradichom and how much it cost and what currency was that in, and oh my gosh, right? There was a language barrier. There was a cultural barrier. But we knew that our siblings in faith still had a foundation of love, and that if we tried hard enough, we could bridge that gap. We have gone cucumber picking in their fields with them. We have offered help in the kitchen. We have worshiped with them in their church, and we were hosted as guests in their house and treated as family. If you have been on a trip, you know this. You probably remember the people who hosted you and how intimate and how close staying in someone's house can be. Or you might know the inverse. If you hosted a Transylvanian choir member last spring, or were here when Main Line invited members of the Warsaw Church to visit us. The Transylvanians rode around the Main Line and saw the stark differences of our lives. They experienced Costco, which was a highlight of the trip. They worshiped with us in our church, and they were guests in our houses and treated as family. Now, just as all relationships, our partner faith relationship was kindled and grown and strengthened through the sharing of our lives, sharing the wonderful, sharing the amazing, sharing the sad and the mundane. I'm going to end this talk about pilgrimage, this talk about connections, with an example of the depth of our friendship. On September 11th, 2001, the World Trade Center was attacked. It was communication chaos, right? Confusion across the country, and especially on the East Coast. I was living in Pittsburgh, and it was very difficult to get in touch with my parents here in Eastern PA. And when I finally got through, I remember hearing that the Vajas family had called from Warsaw, right, to see if we were okay. Now, although now there are paved streets and there's high-speed internet, in 2001, Warsaw had neither paved streets nor high-speed internet, and the phone system was an actual switchboard. So for them to call my parents in Wayne, Pennsylvania, they contacted their switchboard. The switchboard hooked them up to the larger city, which went to a larger city, and then international, right? Wow, connecting through this amazing logistical barrier, eventually international, without translating apps, right? With only 2 or 3 shared words. I think they said, everything's okay in both languages. There's 2 words, okay? Everything's okay. Minden Renben. Love was given. Love was received. That's the power of pilgrimage. The power of pilgrimage is personal connections, right? I met a young man who lived the faith I was trying to preach and trying to promote. Our family and the Vajas family are lifelong friends. Main Line Unitarian Church and the Varfava congregation have a generations-long partnership based on a foundation of personal relationships. You who have been guests, you who have been hosts, you know the power of these personal connections. You know these experiences deeper than words can express. The charge is not just to engage in partnership church events. Yeah, do it. Welcome your partners to Devon again. Go on a trip to Transylvania, absolutely, but go further. Go further. Our life-saving faith charges us to see the divine humanity in everyone we meet, to recognize and welcome their worthiness, their dignity, from the 1500s in Transylvania to this week, right here. Oh, it's so needed. The charge remains the same. Dissent, reach out with love and care. Dissent with love and care. Introduce people to one another. That's radical. Absolutely it is. Be open to those introductions. See beyond our differences and make deep and lasting connections. Amen. And vi sunt lata shra.